Yeah, there's some. So this is when I was Sally Hemings wandering around. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, leading a tour there, which allowed me to put the works of the Metropolitan Museum's period rooms in the context of their who made them, the wealth that produced them, some kind of poetic and literary connections where people are comparing mahogany to the skin of the people who produced it. I mean, it's research. It's research being mediated through a figure. And then going to UVA, I found this new figure by the end of my residency there of the ghost of Thomas Jefferson. I was interested in kind of questions of whiteface, which kind of come up in your talk about, you know, maybe how by performing these figures of the past, you put on the kind of material, you know, echoes of what it means to have a certain type of privilege and what it then means to perform that privilege. And so as this ghost of Jefferson, I staged a performance. It was a longer installation titled in celebration of the life of Sally Hemings. It was like a long memorial service for her. But Jefferson appears at the end. The ghost of Jefferson appears at the end to deliver a eulogy, which he confesses all of the things that he's done and also makes a case for reparations. So I started thinking at the time down in UVA about what it would mean to make a case for and also a program for a reparations project, and what I wanted to see and what I thought Charlottesville might be able to provide. It has a lot of resources. The school, UVA, has a lot of resources. So my work after this became about monumentalizing Sally Hemings, not through performance, but through a kind of collective performance around how to raise money, create a three-pronged foundation that would be able to serve communities kind of in Charlottesville and afar in the spirit of Sally Hemings, to kind of redistribute resources to maybe not, you know, I don't know if there's any sort of fixing that can be done, but something about making it clear that a wrong was once committed and that there needs to be an ongoing kind of healing practice around that. So the Hemings Foundation, you can show the next slide, but the Hemings Foundation is kind of inspired by this sculpture that kept reappearing throughout the work, which is kind of Sally Hemings' bed, but with various things growing out and through it. And so this becomes the kind of image of the Hemings Foundation, a way of galvanizing you know, community around what it means to build not a material monument or memorial, but to kind of invest in something. So the foundation will have a scholarship for a girl between the ages of 13 and 18, which is the age that Sally Hemings kind of lost her chance at freedom in Paris. It will include a fund to support monumental projects, so kind of incubating the idea of new monuments, and the creation of a space. So that's kind of a long-term goal, but what it means to take back time and take back space for artists of color.
Thank you.
So I don't think I'm going to be nearly as concise and linear as you are in your in presenting your incredible work, but I guess sort of this is such a basic question, and yet I actually realized that I hadn't really thought about it before, right? Where it's coming from for me. And my original training was actually, academic training was actually in archaeology. And I learned a lot about classical art. And like one of the things that I think has really stuck with me from that original kind of background is, you know, space is extremely important to me, public space, existing within civic spaces. I spent the majority of my adult life in New York City or in other major cities in different parts of the world, and you know, one thing that is completely, you know, the central point of public sculpture, of course, in classical antiquity is power, right? Like, if you have a statue, it's a statue of an emperor, right? That guy's not emperor anymore, he doesn't have a statue anymore, right? And the extent to which, that kind of like, I guess, that link between power and statues is just so impossible to get away from. And I think that makes, that's true, right? Statues are an expression of power, no matter what. And in my academic work, you throw really clearly, I think, in actually one of the chapters of my dissertation really focused on classical sculpture and how they function in the United States, both within museum spaces, within art spaces, but also within medical schools, where they were used as exemplars of the ideal human body, and of course, also a very raced human body. And so the connections between sculpture and race in the United States, which I think I was first exposed to through Kirk Savage's book, Standing Soldiers and Like Slaves, which is just an incredible book if anyone hasn't read it yet. How much it really is, and it makes sense, right? If race is a discourse that is about bodies, then portrayals of bodies in public space are about race, right? In addition to power. And the other, I guess, strand for me that ties, that brings me to this, to work like the Washington's Next project, is really my abiding interest in the stories that any given group of people tells about the past, right? That is something that I've pretty much always been focusing on one way or another in my scholarship, and also then in the public work that I create, in the art work that I create. It's all about either, interrogating or bringing light to or telling untold stories, right? And trying to figure out ways to understand why we tell the stories that we tell, and also understand how those stories are almost always being told for reasons that, again, have to do with power, right? So I guess all of that stuff kind of converges for me in monuments, in public spaces today, in our cities today, and in particular, as someone who's, the furthest south that I've lived is Northern Virginia, which Southerners will tell you is not the South. And I think they're probably right. That, this project for me, part of what it emerges out of is really just a frustration with how much of the conversation around monuments and racism is just about focused on the Confederacy, right? And the idea that obviously we need to get rid of the statues of Robert E. Lee, okay, yeah, but what else, right? Right, who's next? Exactly, right? And I think Jack's point about, what all of these sculptures that are being highlighted in New York City, how they all are really related to the same moment of, eugenics and racial science and all this stuff, right? And that doesn't surprise me. This is the United States. If we're going to be talking about power, then we're talking about white supremacy. And there's kind of no way around that. So I think that I would say that that's kind of where I'm coming from with this work.
Great. So your frustrations on the dominant dialogue on public art and monuments being focused on the Confederacy actually relates to my next question. So most of my doctorate work was done in the South, and we mainly focused, as you said, Robert E. Lee, Nathan Bedford Forrest, but what are the limitations of solely focusing on that particular time period and those particular people? So you all have mentioned like histories of eugenics, histories of gendered violence. What are the limitations of solely focusing on the Confederacy rather than other oppressive legacies in the United States that appear in the landscape?
Well, I guess I'll just go first quickly because I have the microphone. But I think for me the biggest limitation is this is just one word: scapegoat, right? That the North always loves to do, right? About the South. We're not like that. They're racist down there. We're not like that up here, right? We've never been like that. This is not who we are, right? And I think that that's one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest limitations. But then also, the other questions that it brings up that that the commission is raising too. On all of these questions, right? About what does it mean to commemorate, and who should we be commemorating? And wait a second, what can commemoration look like in a way that isn't also just knocking down one hegemonic figure to put up another one,
I guess what I've learned about some of the problems, just the short time I spent in Virginia with the Confederate monuments as the focus, is that they're very big. They're both literally big, and also they seem to have absorbed a lot of kind of unspoken, seemingly unspeakable meaning for people. And there's kind of a Freudian idea that when the object is removed, the subject is found. And so I think that as challenges were made to the Confederate monuments, and the removal was suggested, a new subject kind of emerged in people. This question of what it means to have lost the Civil War and need some object to fill the void of that unhealed and unresolved anger about a power being lost. And so we're kind of reliving something that really was a war. I mean, it was the bloodiest war our country, I think, fought. So I think it's not a problem I think we have any way around, but I do think those monuments pose a special problem for the whole country and trying to kind of fix something that never really got resolved.
Lyra, could you go to that Roosevelt again? In addition to Lyra's point about scapegoat, there's really the question about the deep way in which the city of New York and the region was deeply entwined with enslavement, first of all. And it's not just that, but it's also that this region was actually ground zero to the eugenics movement internationally. The eugenics record office was in Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island, and it was the work that they were generating, the empirical research that they were doing, supposedly scientific research that was supported by the Carnegie Institution, but also the work that patricians such as Madison Grant, who was one of the founding fathers of New York City institutions, Zoological Society, other organizations, who wrote the book, The Passing of the Great Race, which really became kind of the key historical manual for the international eugenics movement. And in fact, I mean, this is easily said, but I don't mean it so simply, that Adolf Hitler himself referred to this book as his Bible. So we're talking about the ways, not just individuals and monuments were embedded in this highly impactful social movement. For example, in 1924, the US immigration laws were developed based on eugenic standards. And that's why when President Trump talks about why aren't there more Nordics, in the US, that we just need more of them, it's really harkening directly back to eugenics logic about immigration, in which supposed Alpine Central Europeans and Eastern Europeans, and God forbid Mediterranean Europeans should be eliminated from this country, and the numbers of those groups just dropped off the cliff, essentially. So the 24 policy was really eugenics policy. But it's also to say that institutions such as the American Museum of Natural History need to be held accountable. So in the debates about the monuments, they were saying, well, actually Teddy Roosevelt, the outside monument on the steps of the building, was part of the city park system, and therefore that was part of the city's responsibility. But, so therefore the city should decide on what the fate of that monument should be. But in fact, if you look at that monument, you realize that that monument is just the front part of the whole facade of that east side of the museum, which really, I would invite you to go back and look at it if you haven't been there recently, and just look at the whole front, which is all about Teddy Roosevelt and certain kinds of very romantic ideals of what he represented. And it's not just the facade and the parks that are adjacent, but also the whole lobby that's inside. So really, part of what's going on here, and this is why I thought it would be good to show this slide, but also the next one. Could you show this? So this is from, oh, no, excuse me, if you just go back to it, yeah. So this is really inside in the lobby area. And if we're to then, as the Decolonize This Place movement has done, which are made up of really wonderful, brilliant graduate students actually, who've done the research about how that museum has constructed the story of America. And of course, museums of natural history, unlike the Met, which is supposedly about Western civilization and the glories of the US, museums of anthropology tend to be about the various races of mankind and how they are inferior, basically, to the higher Western civilizational ideal and mythology. So the institution itself is really, the entry point is really through Teddy Roosevelt, and really a certain notion of what American futurity was at that time, which was very much defined by eugenics. And I'll just quickly end with the next slide, which is that, so there is a kind of an active reaffirmation of power and white supremacy, as perhaps that we can say with the museums and the city's decision not to make an action. In some ways, it's a real problem because it's just kind of sitting there. I'm not sure how it's going to be resolved. The decision of the commission was in an absolute deadlock, so that the decision has been delayed and it may never be made. But there's also latent power within our midst, oftentimes power that hasn't yet to be rediscovered and discovered to begin with. And this is something that Peter Englot has been working on as well, which is this statue of Wars of America, which is right in Military Park, just a few blocks away from here. And this monument is by Gustav Borglum. He has 4 monuments in Newark. It was just at a moment in which the city of Newark was really very proud of its civics claims and its metropolitan kind of urban building and power. And it commissioned Borglum for these 4 monuments. There's the Indian and Puritan. There's another new landing that got reinstalled, the kind of first Puritans landing in Newark with Lenape looking on. In front of now, it just got reinstalled at NJPAC. And of course, there's the Lincoln in front of the court building. This is the 4th one. This is one of his larger pieces. Borglum, some of you may know, also did Mount Rushmore. And it turns out that Borglum was also an active member of the KKK. Mark Krasovic, who's part of our Price Institute team, has just spent some time at the National Archives and was digging out some of the questions about how active Borglum was with the KKK. And it seems very clear that he was actually very active. It wasn't simply some loose affiliation or whatever. So there's the question now we have of this kind of latent claim to authority and latent kind of history of America through this monument that's in our park just adjacent to us. And what should be done about that? Now, to the credit to the people who are running that park, they would like something to be done. And that's a project now that Salome Tillett and Paul Farver are taking on, because Paul is one of the founders of the Monument Lab in Philadelphia. Salome Tillett is with us in Express Newark, but also the Price Institute. So we're now trying to take on what should be done in a very deliberative, community-engaged way. So we're hoping to, in some ways, complicate this whole question of whether it should be simply taken down and forgotten, or whether it's stayed up and forgotten, right? So in some ways, this latent power is something that we need to kind of unpack and make something that becomes part of our community awareness, and to really reclaim and rethink the history in some very concrete, powerful way.
Great. So I know you mentioned Decolonize This Place in Monument Lab as 2 examples of groups who are grappling with this type of history and the public display of hegemony. But I was wondering, how do you all kind of think about and allocate time to maybe denounce the racists that many of these monuments are dedicated to, versus kind of resuscitating the memories of the oppressed? Is there a type of process or methodology that you go to that helps you decide how you want to allocate your time and whose story you want to tell?
Wow, that's this invites, it's a great question, invites a really good discussion. I'll try to just give a short response. I guess, I'm a little older, so if you live long enough, maybe you get to really try to figure out how to balance it out. In some ways, I think it depends on the opportunities immediately available to you and how you want to make that choice, and how you want to allocate that time. In my case, the question about the unspoken representations of New York City monuments and now extended into this region, my priority is to do research about and to create the possible visualization for dispossession and enslavement in a way that, as far as I know, hasn't quite been done before, and also continues to be at the root of a lot of the mythology that we still hang on to about the origins of the region, either from the Puritan point of view or from the Dutch point of view. But that's in some ways because I'm at a point in my life where I really want to commit to creating the research base to really try to dispense with the myth of the purchase of Manhattan, for example, once and for all. So that's kind of my goal, and my goal for 2026 is to basically change that story so that the tendency will be then, once again, to celebrate this idea that somehow this is the beginning of New York City, which is really a founding myth that is unsubstantial, is undefendable at this point. But it would tend to lapse into that unless something active is organized against it, grounded in solid research.
Well, I had started by being primarily interested in bringing Sally Hemings to life, and cared very little about conversations around Jefferson. But I think as I matured and as the projects matured, I realized one of my goals was to kind of supplant or attach to and dismantle through attachment and kind of pulling apart slowly kind of the integrity of Jefferson until kind of through virtual discourse and actually being on site and engaging on site, Sally Hemings would be undeniable, and that the evidence of her would speak loudly enough that she could never be silenced. And so I think once you start making these stories, building these stories, finding the archive, making the archive, you inevitably get to come face to face with the people who are defending the fort of the oppressor. And it's been really interesting to see Monticello, I would say, evolve in the last 5 years since my being there into having, not saying I did it, but having to come face to face with Sally Hemings. I think it just got too loud for them to ignore people running around their grounds asking where she is. And so they have a room. In the early piece I did there, my sister came and documented for me my performance, and there are a few pictures of me and she and I together in this bathroom that serendipitously is the room that they've turned into her room, which had always been her room. It was a bathroom under the kind of the south wing. So I think sometimes you start doing one thing and the other comes through it, because I think by being living people, we demand that historical living people be, that they matter and that the work gets done, maybe no matter where you start.
Yeah, I think I tend to start at the other end more often, and it's kind of my grad students are here, so they've heard this a million times, but I'm really oriented towards, thinking about audiences and what audiences react to and care about. And that's the only way that I can make the kind of work that I make in the kinds of spaces that I make it in. And audiences, for the most part, random public audiences, they don't care about history, right? That's not of interest. That's not what they're doing in their lives, right? I mean, maybe they might want to read or watch something, at some point for leisure, but that's not what their daily experience is necessarily about, or their experience at a particular festival or wherever else it is that I'm doing an intervention. But they do care about something, and that something often does have to do with something flashy, like George Washington, right? There are so many forgotten by, our society, by the city, enslaved people in New York City that we know about and that, we probably have as much or almost as much documentation related to, and, could equally easily have done, focus on any of them. But that's not, that hook isn't there, and so I guess I tend to actually start more often with the figure that is, or with the, particularly with this project, very much starting with, somebody that people care about, even if they don't necessarily know that that's George Washington. And incidentally, on that handout that y'all got, on the back of it, you'll see the image from the $1 bill, which, as the folks who work at Mount Vernon, the folks who work at the George Washington Papers project, both of whom were like incredibly helpful, not the organizations or institutions, rather the people who work for them, pointed out like it's the most recognizable face on the planet, right? That image. So that's why we put that there, because this is not, there are people who live behind that statue and do not know that that statue is of George Washington. Once you say it's George Washington, immediately people care, right? Because as you say, with Thomas Jefferson, we know all of these things about his psychology or whatever. I mean, a little bit less for George Washington because he doesn't have psychology. He's just really pure and good, exactly, right? He's he cannot tell a lie, all of these things. He's just a great man. But still, right? Like that he is a figure that we know and that we can think about, and somehow through that the contrast becomes more dramatic, and and it makes it more concrete than to talk about slavery in the abstract. I honestly though have to say that like one of the things that surprised me, and those are things that I knew going into this project, things that I did not know going into this project. I did not have any idea of the scale of his slave ownership. Like, I really didn't. In part, that's because, I'd been on Mount Vernon tours originally back when they would say things like, there were 60 slaves here at Mount Vernon, which is true. Well, not just inside the house, at the home plantation, right, at Mount Vernon, which, and again, there's a map inside of your little thing on the second page. Mount Vernon was surrounded by 5 different plantations, which also had a lot more people on them. And then he had, plantations in Southern Virginia and West Virginia, and he was really one of the largest slave owners, period, of his time, of his era. And that also became something really, I thought important about doing this work that I wasn't expecting.
Great, thank you. I wish that I could continue asking you all questions because I have so much more that I'd like to understand. So this is my last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So is there a particular intervention around the monument that you think is productive? And if you can't answer that question, is there an intervention that has not happened that you think should happen in the near future?
I spent some time in Richmond, Virginia, and I think I have kind of built a real commitment to this border state of Virginia, because I do think it's a state where it's a battleground. And in Richmond, there are these really huge monuments down Monument Row, and I think they've gone unaddressed, and there's a lot of conflict around them. But I'm interested in seeing them submerged. I think I'm interested in I have a vision for monuments. There's something in the laws in Virginia that monuments can't be removed, and so there's a lot of battling happening. Yeah. So I'm interested maybe less in what happens to the monuments, but whether this legislation, whether we can be all active in politics, effectively enough to see if we could change that rule, because that's what's holding them up, and it kind of symbolizes the power around them. But I wonder if instead of, in the absence of a law changing, whether they could literally be put down into the ground so that people have to walk down to see them. But I do think projects like Monument Lab are really excellent and kind of the way to incubate and, prototype and then then make changes.
I'm very aware of how much effort it takes to create a monument and to pay for a monument. So I'm interested in interventions in public space. At the same time, whether I would want to spend years of my life trying to create a monument is another thing. At the same time, I have to say that one of the projects I'm really happy to have stumbled into just starting here is the fact that our soccer field has been renamed Frederick Douglass Field. That coming out will happen in April, I believe. And right now, actually Noelle is not here, but she was just here. She was just here. And we're working on creating a counter monument, a monument in a sense of Frederick Douglass and the community surrounding it. It's something that we're hoping to kind of get through the process over the next couple of months. But so when there's an institution that's willing to do that, it's powerful. And of course, it's connected to Rutgers University and many other universities questioning its own patrimony itself. Right? Rutgers himself started out as a Dutch farmer, multi-generational farmer, Lower East Side, actually at the site in which Kiff's massacre and Corlear's Hook had happened. So, and they're enslaved workers, et cetera, et cetera. So just about any earlier colonial figure is involved in very complicated intersectional ways with this earlier colonial history. At the same time, I'm really very much in agreement with Risa, your idea of haunting. And I really believe that the new technologies that we now generally have in our pockets, in our bags, are powerful means in which we can convey these stories and a sense of memory and a sense of monumentalizing and recognition that we haven't yet realized. Somehow, these devices should be used more than simply for Yelp reviews, right? But to do that, I think we have to begin to tap universities and faculty and students in a way that hasn't yet happened yet. I think it's a collective effort that is ahead of us in terms of how can we work together in the regular work that we do, teaching classes, in assignments, in dissertations and papers, in beginning to actually really begin to use the medium, not so much as a way to kind of factually populate with photo images and details, although that's fine, but to basically evoke and provoke a sense of the simultaneity of the past, present, and future in any given place that we're at. And somehow to be inspirational, but also to really have us confront the fact that other things had happened here at another point in time, and to give us a sense that that still exists, that still has an impact. This campus has just gone through Dedication Day, in which it's become very clear of what were the neighborhoods that were here beforehand and what was the price that was paid to kind of create this oasis, in effect. So all those kinds of very powerful questions